The world remembers Sparta through legends of iron discipline, men forged into warriors, and women celebrated for their strength. We picture bronze shields gleaming under the sun, phalanxes locking together like unbreakable walls, and a city that chose death before dishonor. Sparta became a symbol of fearlessness, a name that echoes through the centuries. But behind this mask of glory, a darker story lurked in silence. Sparta's greatness was built not on the courage of its warriors, but on the broken backs of a people they enslaved, the Helots. The Helots were not foreign prisoners or conquered enemies dragged from faraway lands. They were the original inhabitants of Laconia and Messenia, the fertile valleys that fed Sparta. Once free, they were reduced to slavery after brutal conquest. Generations later, they were still there, still enslaved, still waiting in the shadows of Spartan greatness. A Helot child was born already condemned. From the moment of birth, their place in the world was decided. They would work the fields, plow the land, harvest the grain, and deliver it into Spartan hands. They would serve in Spartan homes, tending fires and grinding grain for bread they could not eat. They would raise children who, too, were born only to serve. Sparta prided itself on being a society of equals, the homoioi, the alike. Spartan men were equals because they had the freedom to train endlessly in war. But that equality only existed because the Helots carried the weight of survival for them. Without Helots, Sparta would have had no food, no time, no warriors. And yet, for all their necessity, the Helots were despised. To Spartans, they were less than human. Laboring beasts, necessary but hated. It is said Spartans forced them each year to wear donkey skin caps and dogskin cloaks, mocking them as animals. At banquets, Spartans sometimes brought Helots in, forced them to get drunk, and made their children watch so Spartan boys would grow up despising them. The Helots were a living warning. This is what you must never become. And for Helot women, the burden was heavier still. They were not only slaves of the soil, but also slaves of the body. Spartan men sometimes forced themselves upon them, producing children who were neither fully free nor acknowledged. Helot women cooked meals they were forbidden to share, spun cloth they could never wear, and raised children destined only for servitude. In the homes of Spartan women, the contrast was striking. Spartan wives enjoyed a freedom almost unheard of in the ancient world. They owned property, they managed estates, they commanded respect. But much of that freedom came because Helot women labored beneath them. One woman's strength rested on another woman's chains. The cruelty was not only in physical bondage, but in the absence of hope. Unlike many enslaved peoples in the ancient world, Helots could not be sold abroad. They were bound permanently to the land, their existence tied to the soil of Laconia. There was no escape, no purchase of freedom, no path upward. They were, as one historian described them, a people halfway between slavery and death. Imagine being a Helot child. Your first memories are of fields, endless fields. Your father bends over rows of wheat under the scorching sun, while your mother rises before dawn to grind grain, her hands blistered and swollen. You hear Spartan boys laughing in the distance as they train with spears, while your own brothers are beaten for slowing in their work. You see Spartan girls running, wrestling, their voices filled with freedom, while your sisters are bent double under baskets of grain. From the moment you understand the world, you understand there is no way out. The cruelty of the system was sharpened each year through a ritual that stripped away any illusion of safety. At the start of every year, the Spartan state declared war on the Helots. This was not symbolic. It was legal, a declaration that allowed any Spartan to kill a Helot without fear of blood guilt. For most of the Greek world, killing a slave was still a crime. In Sparta, it was the law of survival, because Sparta was afraid. For all their pride, for all their armor and discipline, Spartans lived with one gnawing truth: the Helots outnumbered them. In some regions, 7 Helots for every Spartan. The fear of revolt hung over the city like a shadow that would never lift. So, the mask of Sparta gleamed with bronze, but its foundations were soaked with fear. The Helots worked in silence, but their silence was not consent. In whispered songs and secret stories passed by firesides, they remembered that they had once been free. Their very existence reminded Sparta of the fragility of its power. And so Sparta doubled down. Violence became routine, mockery became tradition, and terror became law. The world celebrates Spartan warriors who stood at Thermopylae and faced death unflinching. But those warriors only stood there because behind them, Helot women labored unseen, and Helot men tilled the earth they themselves would never own. Sparta's mask of freedom was never real. It was a lie built on chains, sharpened by fear and polished with blood. And in the shadows of that mask, the Helots waited, silent, suffering, and unforgettable. If Sparta's greatness rested on the labor of the Helots, then Sparta's survival rested on keeping them broken. The Spartans did not merely enslave, they built a system of oppression unlike anything else in the ancient world. Each year, as the autumn harvest approached, Spartan officials performed a ritual so chilling it became infamous across Greece. The Ephors, 5 powerful magistrates, declared war on the Helots. It was not a war in the usual sense, but a ritual license. From that moment, Spartans could kill any Helot without crime, without guilt, without stain of blood upon their souls. To the Helots, it meant living in a constant state of terror. At any hour, at any moment, a Spartan could appear, spear in hand, knife in the dark, and your life could end without warning. It was not lawless chaos, it was law itself. A machine of fear designed to crush even the thought of rebellion. But the most terrifying weapon in this machine was the Krypteia. The Krypteia was a ritualized secret police, made up of young Spartan men, chosen from the strongest and most promising of their age. To outsiders, it seemed like an initiation rite, a test of endurance and cunning. To the Helots, it was a season of death. The youths of the Krypteia were sent out into the countryside armed only with daggers. They moved silently at night, hiding in shadows, watching the fields where Helots worked. Their task was simple: kill. Not in battle, not in open war, but through terror. They killed Helots they found wandering alone. They struck down the strongest, the tallest, the ones who looked most likely to resist. It was not extermination, it was pruning, cutting away the heads of any potential uprising. Imagine the scene: a Helot man returning home at dusk after a day in the fields. He carries a sack of grain on his back, his body weary but his mind still dreaming of his family waiting by the hearth. From the reeds, the young Spartans emerge. A flash of a blade. The sack spills to the ground. By morning, his body lies cold in the dust, and his village whispers in silence, afraid even to grieve. For the Spartan youths, the Krypteia was their first taste of killing. For the Helots, it was proof that no life was safe, no strength allowed, no future permitted. This ritualized violence turned fear into permanence. A Helot never knew when he might be watched, when his strength might be noticed, when his ambition might be punished. Fear became the invisible chain that bound them tighter than ropes ever could. But terror was not only in killing, it was in humiliation. At Spartan banquets, Helots were sometimes forced to appear drunk, staggering, made into living lessons for Spartan boys. See, their masters would say, this is what weakness looks like. This is what you must never become. The Helots were denied dignity, even in mockery. Their suffering was entertainment, their degradation a tool of education. Some were forced to wear ridiculous costumes, donkey skin caps, dog skin cloaks, to mark them as beasts, not men. A Helot in such garb was a walking reminder of subjugation, visible proof of Sparta's contempt. And yet, through all of this, the Helots endured. They harvested, they served, they raised families. They carried within them a silent resistance, not in rebellion, not yet, but in survival itself. For the women, endurance carried its own cruelty. Helot women bore the weight of back-breaking labor, raising children while also serving Spartan households. They endured the presence of Spartan men who, under state sanction, sometimes forced themselves upon them. In such moments, their bodies became yet another battlefield of oppression. And yet, through these women, Helot culture survived. Whispered lullabies, stories of ancestors, memories of a life before chains. The Spartans thought themselves clever in their cruelty. They believed this machine of oppression would keep the Helots forever silent. Yet the very need for constant violence betrayed the truth. Sparta lived in fear. A society that prided itself on courage and discipline was, at its heart, terrified of the people it enslaved. The shield walls and bronze helmets, the harsh training of the Agage, the endless drills, all of it was not just for war abroad. It was preparation for war at home, because every Spartan child grew up knowing that just beyond the fields the Helots waited, outnumbering them, watching them, hating them, and sometimes that hatred broke its silence. Throughout Sparta's history, there were Helot revolts, sparks of fury that flared despite the crushing weight of oppression. The most famous came after a devastating earthquake in 464 BCE. The ground shook, houses collapsed, and hundreds of Spartans were buried alive. As dust rose over the ruined city, the Helots saw their chance. They rose in rebellion, seizing strongholds, arming themselves, daring for once to break the silence of centuries. For years, Sparta bled in this hidden war. What history often forgets is that the Spartan army, so proud, so invincible in legend, struggled desperately to contain an uprising of the very people they called beasts. It was only with aid from other Greek states that Sparta managed to crush the revolt. And even then, the fear never left them. Every harvest, every winter, the memory lingered. Beneath their boots lay not beasts, but people waiting for revenge. Thus, the machinery of oppression continued. Ritualized killings, humiliations, the annual declaration of war, the mask of glory demanded the fuel of blood. Sparta stood as a warrior state admired and feared by Greece, but within its borders, the Helots lived in a prison without walls, a prison built not of stone, but of terror. And so, the machinery turned on, year after year, grinding lives into silence, until the body of Sparta itself began to rot from within. The Helot system was designed to crush hope, but no system of terror is perfect. In the shadows of oppression, the Helots learned to resist, not always with swords, but with whispers, rituals, and survival strategies that slowly chipped away at the illusion of Spartan control. Resistance began where Spartan eyes could not always see. In the homes, in the fields, in the hidden spaces of daily life, Helot women became the custodians of memory, teaching their children the names of ancestors long erased from Spartan records. They preserved stories of freedom, of the land before conquest, whispering them during long nights by the fire. In their songs and weaving, patterns, messages of endurance and rebellion were concealed. What looked like simple melodies or textile designs to a Spartan overseer carried hidden meaning for those who knew how to listen. Even the smallest acts of defiance mattered. A missed harvest quota, a broken tool, a sheep that wandered astray, all could be quiet gestures of sabotage. To the Spartans, it might look like clumsiness or bad luck. To the Helots, it was a way to remind themselves that they had not surrendered their will completely. But sometimes resistance turned into open defiance. The greatest crack in Sparta's wall of terror came in 464 BCE, when a massive earthquake ripped through the city. Buildings collapsed, temples crumbled, and hundreds of Spartan citizens were killed in the ruins. For a moment, the unbreakable Sparta looked vulnerable. The Helots saw their chance. From the fields of Messenia and Laconia, Helot communities rose up. They armed themselves with stolen weapons, farm tools sharpened into blades, even stones torn from collapsed walls. They occupied Mount Idhome, a towering fortress of rock, turning it into a citadel of rebellion. What began as a desperate grasp for freedom soon became a war that would last nearly a decade. The Spartans, though famed as warriors, struggled. Their armies were trained to fight in perfect formation, shield locked to shield, phalanxes pressing forward. But the Helots fought differently. They fought in the mountains, ambushing patrols, cutting supply lines, striking quickly before disappearing into the forest they knew better than any Spartan. It was not just men who resisted. Archaeological traces and fragments of testimony suggest that Helot women played vital roles, smuggling messages, hiding food, gathering intelligence. Some served as spies within Spartan households, quietly relaying information to fighters in the hills. Others aided in sabotage, poisoning wells, or secretly damaging weapons and armor. This revolt terrified Sparta more than any foreign war, because here, the enemy was not Persia, not Athens, but the people who tilled their fields, baked their bread, and raised their children. Every Spartan household suddenly felt vulnerable. Every Helot servant became a potential conspirator. The war dragged on for nearly 10 years. The Spartans could not crush the rebellion alone. Eventually, they called for help from Athens, their supposed rival. At first, the Athenians answered, sending troops to aid Sparta. But Sparta, suspicious of Athenian motives, sent them home. An insult that would ignite decades of mistrust between the two greatest powers of Greece. In the end, Sparta only broke the revolt by sheer exhaustion and brutality. The Helots on Mount Idhome surrendered. Some were slaughtered, others exiled. The dream of freedom for a time was extinguished. But Sparta had been changed. The revolt exposed the truth, that beneath the image of invincible warriors, Sparta was a fragile state living in constant fear of the people it oppressed. From then on, the control over the Helots became even harsher. More killings, more humiliation, more terror. And yet the Helots remembered. Each revolt, though crushed, kept the memory alive. Each act of defiance, no matter how small, carried forward the knowledge that Sparta could be resisted. Historians often describe Sparta as a military state, but in truth it was a state built on anxiety. The agage, the brutal training of Spartan boys, was not only preparation for war abroad, it was preparation for the war at home. The Spartans trained every child to kill because they knew that someday the Helots might rise again. And rise they did again and again. Lesser revolts flared throughout the centuries, each one reminding Sparta that their society stood on a knife's edge. The fear became part of the culture. The walls of Sparta were not stone fortifications. Famously, the Spartans built none, but the constant readiness to suppress the people they enslaved. This fear corroded Sparta from within. While other Greek states innovated in art, philosophy, and politics, Sparta stagnated, obsessed with control. Citizens dwindled in number, their rigid system unable to adapt. The more brutal they became, the more fragile their society grew. And at the heart of this cycle were the Helots, women and men who, despite centuries of terror, preserved a memory of resistance. They remind us that even the most powerful systems of oppression carry within them the seeds of their own undoing. The breaking point had not yet come, but the cracks were spreading. And when Sparta finally began to collapse, it would not be from enemies abroad, but from the weakness bred by its own cruelty. Sparta liked to imagine itself eternal, a society of perfect warriors carved from stone, immune to the decay that consumed other cities. But history is merciless. No empire built on terror can last forever. By the 4th century BCE, cracks in Sparta's armor were impossible to ignore. The endless suppression of the Helots had drained the state of vitality. Every Spartan child grew up with a sword in hand, but fewer and fewer children were being born. Their rigid system, where only full-blooded citizens counted as Spartans, meant that when numbers dwindled, they could not replenish themselves. At its height, Sparta may have had 8,000 full citizens. By the time of its decline, fewer than 1,000 remained. This collapse of manpower was not just chance. It was the direct consequence of a society obsessed with controlling others. While Helots toiled in the fields, Spartans refused to farm, trade, or create. They prided themselves on rejecting money and culture. But without those things, Sparta could not adapt to a changing world. The Helots gave them food, but no future. Even in their weakened state, the Spartans clung to cruelty. Every year, the Krypteia still hunted Helots. Every harvest, overseers still demanded tribute. But the more Sparta shrank, the more obvious the imbalance became. A few hundred Spartan warriors ruling over tens of thousands of enslaved people was not strength. It was desperation. Breaking blow came in 371 BCE at the Battle of Leuctra. The Thebans, under the brilliant general Epaminondas, shattered the Spartan army. For the first time, the myth of Spartan invincibility was destroyed in open battle. Warriors who had trained since boyhood, men bred only to fight, were crushed. In the aftermath, Thebes struck directly at Sparta's heart. They marched into Messenia, the land the Spartans had seized centuries earlier, and did something unthinkable. They freed the Helots. On the slopes of Mount Ithome, the very place where Helot rebels had once held out decades before, a new city was founded, Messene, a beacon of liberation. The Helots, who had endured generations of bondage, were finally granted independence. For Sparta, this was more than a military loss. It was the collapse of their entire system. Without Helots to farm their land, the Spartan state withered. The warriors who once dominated Greece were reduced to a provincial power, a shadow of their former glory. The irony is hard to miss. Sparta, the most feared city of Greece, destroyed itself not through foreign conquest, but through its own cruelty. By building its society on the backs of the Helots, it created a system too rigid to survive change. It robbed itself of creativity, diplomacy, and resilience. It chose terror over trust and paid the price. But what of the Helots themselves? History leaves them in shadows. We know little of individual names, of personal stories. The Spartans did not record their voices. They erased them. And yet traces survive. Songs passed down in fragments, hints of rituals tied to fertility and harvest. Archaeological clues of villages that thrived again after freedom was won. Most haunting of all is the legacy of silence. For centuries, the Helots endured, nameless, faceless, buried beneath the legend of their masters. Yet without them, Sparta could not exist. Every Spartan shield, every spear, every war was made possible by Helot labor. The Helots were both invisible and essential, erased from history, but written into its foundation. This paradox is perhaps the cruelest part of their story. They were indispensable and despised, necessary and humiliated, bound and yet feared. And so when we remember Sparta today, its warriors, its phalanxes, its austere way of life, we must also remember the Helots, for without them, the Spartan myth is nothing but smoke. The Helot system is a warning carved into history. It shows what happens when a society tries to build strength by crushing others. Fear becomes the ruler, cruelty the foundation. But fear corrodes, and cruelty is brittle. The Spartans believed they were eternal, but the Helots, in their endurance, outlived them. Their story lingers like a shadow, a reminder that no power is unbreakable, no oppression absolute, and that even in silence, the oppressed keep their memory alive, waiting for the day when the walls of their masters finally collapse.